Hi everyone, welcome back to Dadsplaining Politics.
Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a lot to talk about as usual. We'll do a little rundown on our topics. If you want to do that, Dada, feel free.
Well, we're going to talk about the King Charles's visit to Canada and what a triumph for Mark Carney. A little on the Romanian election that was held recently, the Harvard ban on international students, or the Trump ban on Harvard international students, latest controversy on the potential super tax for over $3 million balances in Australia, and the latest on the Liberals Nationals breakup and reunification.
All right, so you start off because I think that you're particularly interested
Well, as you
in
know,
this
a bit of
first one.
background. As you remember, Trump wanted to make Canada the first state of the US, and Mark Carney won a landslide election victory as the Canadian Liberal leader, and is now the Prime Minister of Canada. And for those of you who probably know that Canada is a constitutional monarchy, so the head of state of Canada is King Charles. And the interesting thing, this is why Carney is so smart. Trump loves the royal family. You know, the history, the pomp, and the
Which we've
authority
definitely talked about before in
of the
previous
royal
episodes
family.
as well.
So for Carney to invite Charles to open the Canadian Parliament as the head of state is such a PR triumph and such a sort of finger in the eye of Donald Trump. Super smart. So I think Charles was up for it. He and Camilla really enjoyed the experience and lots of incredible footage. And Carney seeming very relaxed, and he's really come a long way as the sort of dour central banker to the star of the Liberals throughout the world.
Yeah, I think that your bromance with Carney is, a bit much at times, but obviously he's someone to definitely be respected. Yeah, no, it's been an incredible tour, and I also think, given the fact that the royal family hasn't been viewed in the most impressive light in recent years, especially after Queen Elizabeth passed away, this is probably going to be a good popularity push for them, especially in Canada, right? Because it's the lesser of two evils. I know that you won't say that the royal family is an evil, but, you get the protection of the crown, something that, is traditionally very respected, as opposed to just being on your own, isolated from the rest of the world and just trying to depend on your own allies. So they have this sphere of protection that they'd be very grateful for. And I think I even saw some people commenting how beautiful it is that people get to protest the royal family and protest the monarchy in Canada, because even that act of being able to do that is something that the crown is allowing and facilitating because they're protecting Canada and its sovereignty. So therefore, they're protecting people's right to protest, which is incredibly ironic. And I know that a lot of people could disagree with me on that. For me, for one, I'm not necessarily a big fan of the monarchy, and I believe that it's a really complicated system, but we're not going to get into that right now.
This is a
Yeah.
great triumph for Charles because I think people would consider he's done a great job since becoming
Mm.
king, and a hard act to follow, with his cancer diagnosis and reaching out to cancer patients. And now doing this really astute political move in conjunction with Carney can only do him good in the eyes of the world. And
Definitely, and now he's transformed into a modern leader, of which he was not before. He was simply following in the traditional footsteps of his mother. But I think there's only so much you can do, because once you start testing the limits of the monarchy and the role of the monarchy politically, then you start to think, God, what is the role of the monarchy itself, and does it have relevance anymore? Because you're just getting a guy who's been raised in a palace to express his opinion on certain things. And yes, he has influence right now because it's the first time he's ever done it, and because it's a landmark situation for like the royal family to be interfering in political affairs. But once it becomes the norm, I don't think people have as much respect for it anymore. That's what I'm gonna say.
well, it's a balance, but thousands of years of history, and I'm sure Canadians are very happy to have him as their head of state at the moment versus a Trump presidency as the 51st state. So very, very
But
clear.
how depressing that we're vying between imperial powers, which imperialist power we owe our allegiance to. Like, do we owe our allegiance to the Commonwealth? Do we owe our allegiance to the expansionist, imperialist rhetoric of America trying to like have hegemonic control over the whole region? Do we owe our allegiance to China? That's the state of the world right
That's the
now.
world we live in at the moment.
And how
Yes.
depressing. How depressing.
No, I don't
I
think it's
think
that.
you need to realize that,
We'll see. You didn't roll
Okay.
with the punches. Let's move to the Romanian election, which happened quite recently. And there was big fears that the right-wing candidate was going to win, the anti-EU, pro-Russia candidate. But fortunately, the mayor of Bucharest beat the right-wing candidate. So I think everyone held a sigh of relief on that, because if you think about Hungary already being sort of pro-Russia, if Romania becomes pro-Russia and anti-EU, it's very, very dangerous. So I think many EU leaders were having a sigh of relief over that result.
Definitely, we had talked about it earlier on. I'm not sure if it was this year or if it was last year, but in the way that the elections work in Romania is that there are multiple rounds of voting, right? To try and determine what the public feeling is. And the earliest rounds were dominated by a politician who came to prominence on social media. So it's also a win against propaganda, I guess you could say, and against the use of social media to like infiltrate people's feed and, you know, provide an echo chamber for them to vote for one specific candidate rather than another and not get a varied like group of sources for this information about voting.
Yeah.
Don't
No,
you think?
yes, absolutely. Very good result overall for the Romanian people. If we move on now to the latest Trump competition or attacking of Harvard, the latest move there is that Trump has said Harvard is not allowed to have any international students. They won't be approved in terms of their visas, etc. And I think something like 40% of the students at Harvard are of international origin. So this is a huge blow to the university and the leading nature of American educational institutions. Of course, Harvard has sued the administration, and I think there's a stay on putting that into place. But it's very much brinkmanship and typical of a scenario where a bully like Trump is stood up to, and then he attacks further.
Yeah, I mean, of course, he's just trying to gut the institutions from the inside out, so then they fall apart without his support. You know, they've always typically been incredibly negative about Trump and incredibly critical of everything he does, these institutions, because they have experts in policy and politics
And
and
typically
foreign
they're very,
affairs, and they
they're
know what
very,
they're talking about, and they're typically liberal because of that.
yes.
So, I know there's been a lot of student protests, though, in response to all of this, and everyone's been really supportive of the fact that Harvard have been standing up to them as opposed to other universities like Columbia, which I think they just accepted
It is,
the
but
changes.
it's shocking for American leadership in the world, because think about it. I was just at breakfast and someone was talking about one of their children going to the US and they're now looking elsewhere, right? Because you don't want to have your child going to a US university and then having their visa ripped up, right? So the
No, of course not.
von der Leyen the other day said all the people who are going to go to Harvard are welcome in Europe. This is an opportunity for other countries who have great educational institutions and universities to leverage this. And in long term, it's incredibly damaging to the US.
No, of course it is. I think it's also interesting. We often talk about the brain drain when it comes to New Zealand and even Australia, right? You know, all the smartest, intelligent people who are ready to begin entrepreneurial activities, they move overseas instead of staying at home. And now that's happening in the US, which is a bizarre scenario because the US was always the focal point of migration and everyone wanted to end up in the US, but now it's becoming the place people are moving away from in order to continue their studies. And that's ridiculously like massive turnaround of events. So that's quite interesting.
The other news overnight was that Elon has departed back to his Tesla and SpaceX, etc., and he was
Not
given a
really.
nice thank you by Trump and everything. So it seems like they're still friends, but there's some distance between them now.
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that. Structurally, the reason why Elon has left is because his capacity as, let me double check, his service as a special government employee has a time cap on it. So there's only so long he can actually remain as a special government employee without having gone through like the institutional steps or having been elected, etc., etc. So there was a time limit and he reached that time limit, and so he has to leave whether he wants to or not. There's been multiple bizarre comments by everyone else. So I think Elon said as he was going out, this is not the end of Doge, but only the beginning. Trump says Elon's going to be coming in and out. He's going to be coming in and out all the time, having chats. He's just taking a break. And I don't really think this is the end of anything. Maybe we'll see him slightly less in the background of all the press conferences, hovering menacingly behind
Well, I
Zelensky,
contend,
etc.,
Freddie, that
etc.
they've got all the data they need on all the American taxpayers, etc. So they now have all that data. So he has what he came after, which is the data, I think.
But yeah, for sure. I also think it's interesting that Trump has now increased tariffs on aluminium from 25% to 50%. That's also a massive thing that's happened in the past
Yes.
few days. I know you're laughing
Whether you can
because
believe it or not, whether it will be cut down again. I mean, I think people are getting weary of this whole thing. And, whether now I contend that everyone, including the EU, is just delaying any negotiation because there's no point, right? There's no
I mean,
point.
that's what I think. That's what I think we should talk about, though. The fact that the stock market. So this happened, right? Tariffs increased to 50%, and that was after America made a deal with the Japanese Nippon Steel Corporation. So they're assuming that they will have this deal and trade will continue with them, and they won't need to have trade with anyone else. And however, in the international trade courts in the US, they have found that the tariffs are unconstitutional and illegal. So they may have a part to play in restricting how the tariffs are going to come into place and taking the tariffs away, because I think traditionally, I was looking into it, the American president should not have as much power when it comes to tariff. It's generally a congressionally
Right.
approved move, not a presidentially approved move. So we're going to see how them putting a pause on tariffs will take effect. I think it has to go through a number of different courts now, the appeals court and then potentially the Supreme Court. So, we're stuck at the moment. We don't know what's going to happen. And what was interesting about this, as you said, leaders don't want to deal with it because he's so erratic that we don't know what the next move is he's going to make. It's the same thing with the stock market. It seems the stock market doesn't want to deal with it or make any changes because he's been so erratic, even though a pause on tariffs should benefit the stock market and it should
Which it
mean that the
has
stock
over
market would
recent
go up.
weeks.
A very minimal amount. This only happened in the past few days, actually. So I don't know what you're talking about over recent weeks.
Over the last few weeks, since the stay on the tariffs, the stock market has gone up. But my contention now is there's so many changes that the stock market is getting weary of it and not reacting quite as much as it did in
Well,
the
yeah,
early.
that's what I was about to say. That's what I was trying to say. That, they're wary.
Yeah, and
But
then
yeah,
I heard about this international trade court, which I'd never heard of before, which has it said, this is the point of this court that's saying you've gone beyond your
yeah, that's what I'm
realms.
talking about. I'm talking about the International Trade Court. That's what I
Okay,
said,
okay,
actually.
good.
But you obviously weren't listening to what I was
Clearly
saying.
not. Shall we move on to super tax, the over $3 billion tax? And
Yep,
I want to give
let's
a
do that.
shout out to Howard Digby. He had one of our listeners. Thank you for listening. He had a good discussion with me about this. And just as a bit of background, so this is a new tax that the Labor government is going to bring in for superannuation balances greater than 3 million. There's been some pushback by some people about it, primarily because of they're going to start taxing unrealized gains versus realized gains. And a realized gain is when you've made an investment and then you've sold those shares. That's a realized gain. Realize you still own the shares, you haven't sold them, and the tax department will take a snapshot of the value and tax you on that before you've even sold them, which is a new thing. And that's what a lot of people are against. The other thing people are against is the $3 million is not indexed, so it doesn't go up with inflation. So people are saying in 20 or 30 years, a lot more people will be covered by that. I don't think that is the biggest issue. I think the core issue is the unrealized gains. And in fact, the fact is, super is to help supplement people's retirement. It shouldn't be for huge balances, above $3 million. So I'm not against the $3 million scenario, but just the implementation of it in terms of this unrealized gains, I think is the challenge.
I agree. I almost think that Labour was so excited about the fact that they're returning to government. They wanted to make a statement and prove that they were going to change things this time around and they were going to make a difference. But maybe they are getting a bit cocky with the fact that they have such a majority government and they only need the approval of the Greens to put this through. They've decided to go full steam ahead with something that could have used a little bit more deliberation. But
Yes.
that's coming from my fairly low economics knowledge and background, so I know that you have obviously said a lot about this, but it's interesting as well. I've heard the reaction of people to this tax, right? Just in the community, even family members talking about how it's a disgusting thing and it's going to change everyone's lives, etc., etc. But it's only going to target 0.5% of the population over the next year.
You're right.
It's really an outlier in the community. If you have over $3 million worth of superannuation, is a ridiculous number. I don't think most people we know or have even met have this number. So it's weird that people take offense to something that probably won't even have an impact on their lives,
You're right.
simply because they don't understand the system. And there's a lot of big words coming out: taxes, superannuation, lots of words that scare people. But
But
how
you're
much
right.
effect will it really have?
It's right. It's good that the government's doing something about this. If they don't, the cost of the superannuation system will be more than the age pension in
Mm.
10 to 15 years' time if they don't do something. So it's important they do something. They've just got to have the nuances correct, right? In
Yeah,
terms
for
of
sure.
realized
For
gains.
sure. And like it is affecting a very specific like person in Australia. And I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing, obviously, that they're being taxed on wealth, because this is a wealth tax. And, income taxes can only do so much, because then you have people who are heiresses, simply put, and they have been gaining wealth on that their entire lives and not having any income. So how are they supposed to be taxed on the money that they have? Because it's never that equitable that someone should have such a ridiculous amount more than someone else.
You're right, Freddie. And it goes to how brave the government is with their huge majority and the coalition in disarray, how brave they are, and whether they will cut the capital gains tax discount on property, etc., after a year.
Definitely.
Another big cost to the government. Not that difficult to do, but it's been one of those sacred cows nobody's wanted to touch politically. So it'll be fascinating whether Labor does wade into that.
It'll be fascinating whether they keep the really outlandish policies, such as this one, and controversial ones to this year, this following year, and they get them all out. And then by the time the next election cycle comes
Well,
around, they're being smarter, and they're doing all the happy-go-lucky policies. But I think it's also interesting, in response to this, there have been some consultants who have said their clients, some of the incredibly wealthy people who are being targeted, have now been considering moving assets offshore. So we're seeing a flight of wealth in response to this, and how that's going to affect our economy in general will be quite interesting. And it's going to take effect on July 1st.
yeah.
So that's
I,
not
I,
that far away, a month away.
for me, that's a sort of hollow threat, if you will. You know,
Mm.
I think people always say this stuff. Shall we move on to the Liberals and Nationals? They're now back together. They have announced their shadow cabinet, as the government has announced their cabinet. We spoke about that last week. So Susan Ley, I think, has come out of this rather well, as rather calm and determined as a leader, whereas David Littleproud has sort of lost most of his credit. And the question is, will he survive the longer term? There's a lot of knives out for him. And the fact is, Susan Lay's still going to have a difficult time, because they've got to at some point agree their climate policy. And this is the major point of contention between the Nationals and the Liberals. So that'll be interesting how that comes to pass. But I don't know what you have to say
Well, I
about
mean,
that.
definitely, because obviously the coalition had an agreement on net zero carbon emissions by 2050, and that's been in place for a while. And you think about how backwards and traditional they are when it comes to climate change policy. 2050 net zero target is not an impressive target, and it's not what we need at the moment to really make a difference. So it's hilarious to me that this is becoming a topic of conversation, and it's become so controversial, because it is so far from the average what we need in the world right now, or from what the Paris Agreement requires, etc., etc., that it's bizarre. These people are just, they're not locked in. The Nationals members obviously are advocating to completely get rid of the net zero target, and they have come out in various press conferences offering different opinions on the subject, which shows that Littleproud definitely doesn't have them on a cohesive
Communication strategy.
policy, rhetoric, and communication strategy. And it seems like absolute havoc. So what does that say about the Nationals without the Liberal Party, that maybe they have no real leadership structure?
No, you're right. I
So
think
so that's been quite interesting to see.
And Susan Ley has made some good moves, like Jane Hume pushed to the backbench. She was behind the not allowing people to work from home, that policy. So I think there's some good moves by Susan Ley in terms of
Mm,
Angus Taylor relegated to defence industries, I think, shadow defence
mm.
industries. So really good, actually. I mean, I think she's made all the right moves so far, and wish her all the luck because it's going to be a rough ride.
I mean, definitely. And we've also seen a few members of the Liberal Party saying how important climate is to their electorates, narrowly defeating independents in a various group of different electorates and then saying, look, we need to improve our policy, if not keep it as it is. Otherwise, we're going to be losing these seats next time round. And the fact that that's what lost them all their inner city seats and they're arguing about whether it's necessary or not as a policy is like absolutely ironic. So
And
we'll see what happens.
Bradfield is still in play. There was
It
like
is still in play.
two votes the other day. I don't know what
Hmm.
the latest is. Here we are. As of 2:57 yesterday, Giselle Capterian had 56,134 votes against Nicholas Bowles' 56,133 votes. One
Nicolette
vote
Bowl.
ahead. Nicolette Bowles, one vote ahead.
Bowl.
This is crazy.
Yeah, no, it's ridiculous. But obviously, the recount process is very, very, very well organized and almost too rigorous, like as a procedure. I think you have to count the ballots twice, and you have to have two people watching you as you count the ballot to make sure you're counting it properly. And then you have to figure out how many first preference votes and then do the whole preferential distribution process again, which, if you guys don't know how that works, it's fairly complicated. But it's basically like, put first preference, and then the people who have gotten the least votes are determined, the people who did terribly in that electorate, they get taken out of the process, and then the votes get redistributed to second preferences, and then someone who could have come third in an electorate can end up coming first simply from secondary votes. It's a complicated process, but that's virtually how it works. So they have to do that whole complicated calculation process again, as well as double checking the vote count again.
Luckily, we have the AEC. Anyway, we'll be able to give
Mm-hmm.
everyone the results of this next week. I'm sure it will be determined by then. In the meantime,
Definitely.
thank you for joining us on Dad's Planning Politics. Please remember to tell all your friends about us and subscribe and have a great weekend.
Thank you.